let's start with a brief rundown of what we're looking to achieve in this week's workshop. So first, we want to be able to create a new Angular project. So using the methods we've used before, using the ng space new space name of our project, we can create that project. Once we've got the default project created, we'll then want to be able to create 3 components. One will be a login component, the other a menu component, and an account component. So how this is going to work is when we come to our page, we'll have 2 menu items. One is login, one's account. When we click on the login component, a form should appear, which allows us to enter a username as an email and a password. When they submit that form, it should check that against a known value in the background. And if it's okay, then we'll be able to move on and view the accounts page. So let's go ahead and start to create this then. So in our terminal, let's start by creating a new Angular application. So we use the ng command, new, and the name of our particular app. I'll just call mine week4. And I'm going to add an extra option on here, which is for routing. And this will automatically create for us an extra routing module. Saves us having to create it manually later on. So we let that do its thing and create all the files that we need. This can take just a minute or two. I'll just pause while it keeps going. Okay, so that's finished. It's loaded our new application. Let's just do a directory listing just to check what we've got here. So we've got our new application in the directory of week4. So change directory to that. Let's do a listing. And so we see all the appropriate files have been created. So we can now start coding, and we'll move to Atom to do that. Okay, so here we are in Atom. I've added my project folder into the project section here, and we can see at the moment within our source directory and then app, we have our default app components, modules, and routing module that were created as part of the default setup process. So next thing we want to do, we actually talked about when we looked at this here that we were going to create a login component, a menu component, and an account component. So let's go ahead and do that. For that, we'll go back to our terminal, and in here we do ng, we're using the Angular command, and we want to generate. So we can either type in the word generate, or we can use the shortcut. We could then type in component as the component or the thing we would like to generate. We can also shortcut that to just C, and the first thing we'll do is create the login component. And so that's one's done. The next one we want to do, we want to generate a component, and we'll call it menu. And the third we want to do is an ng C for generate component, and we'll call it account. Okay, let's go back to Atom and see what we now have. Okay, so in Atom, we now see we have these extra directories here, which account for the 3 components we've just added. So in our first component that we might do, we'll actually create, given it's our menu, we'll go in here and we'll generate the HTML code that's required for that particular component. So this will be a navigation, and we'll use an unordered list to create our links. Now, a slight difference to what you would have in normal HTML, rather than using the href. In here we're using a router link to define it as a route. And first one will be login, and save some typing. We just cut and paste that one, and it's going to become account, and it will be to a path of account. We want to close our UL tag and then close our nav tag. So that completes the HTML required for our menu component. So we can not use that anymore. Let's come in now and have a look at the app component HTML. So if we ran this right now, we would see that this particular content would come up as the default. So it's the page that's being run when we first run this particular app. We don't need any of this because we don't want to display that. And we get rid of the comment. And here we'll create a div. We'll give it an ID. Close the div. And in here, the first thing we're going to show is the menu. Okay, so where did we get this particular sort of custom tag from? If we come down into our menu component.ts file, we'll see here that it defines a selector for this particular component, so that if we use that selector in our page, then this particular component will be loaded into that position. Okay, so let's go back here. So we want that. We'll have pretty much everything else will be loaded into a section of this page. So with this, with Angular, we're creating essentially a single page application. So what this router outlet is for is a location in this page where our different routes will load into. So that's what we've got with the router outlet. Okay, let's move on next, and we'll actually create the form that will be for our login page. So if we open up the login component.html file, so what we're going to include in here will be a form, and in that we'll have an input, which will be, firstly, the one will be of type email. That way we can use some HTML5 validation for it. We'll put in a placeholder, and we'll just say to put in a some username. We'll give a name field to this, which will be username, and we could also want to add in an ID, and that will also be username. So that has our input. We'll add our second input. So a bit of typing. The type for this one will be a HTML type of password. So that's one that will just put up bullet points when we put in there, so it's a bit more secure, so people aren't seeing what our password is. Placeholder of password, we'll give it a username of password and an ID of password, and then make sure, or the next thing, we'll want some sort of a button on here. It will be of type submit. Just want to be able to submit the page, and submit button, and then we want to close off our form. Now we'll be adding a little bit more into this to make it interactive for sending stuff back, but that's essentially the code for our basic HTML code for our form. So let's move now to the app.module.ts file. So this was created as part of the default creation of our application. And this app.module.ts is a way of grouping together the components, directives, services that make up our particular application. So we'll notice in here, as we've been using our ng commands, that it's automatically added into here our logging component, our menu component, and our account component. We added that -- routing option when we created our application to begin with. It's added that routing module in as an import to bring that routing module in. And it's assigned as a bootstrap, so not to be confused with Bootstrap for CSS. This is basically the component that will be run when this application is first started. So bootstrapping as in running from the first time. So in this case, by default, it was adding in the default app component, which we find over here. So our default app component, we've already edited that to add in our menu and a router outlet for our routes to go to. So that's what we have here so far. So let's go back to our command line now, and we will try and run our app and see what it looks like at the moment. So we run ng serve. Just wait a moment for that to load. So we should end up with a server running on localhost port 4200. So if we come into our browser and we load up localhost 4200, what we should see in there now is essentially our menu. If we have a look at our source, we can see what's actually been loaded into there. So we have our content coming from app root. Inside that, we had our div container. Inside that was our app menu, which is then now showing our menu items. And we have a router outlet below that, which will then allow us to put content from our different components into that particular location. Okay. You'll notice that if we try to click on these, we're not going to go anywhere because we don't have any particular routes set up for those things to do anything yet. So let's go and create routes for those particular components now as the next thing. So we're back here in our app routing module. So this was the one that was created with the -- routing option when we first created our app. And in here, we'll find an array, excuse me, that we can use to list the different routes that we'd like to have. So the syntax for this is we create an object as each item within the array, and the object by default just takes two parameters. One, which is the path for the route. Oops, sorry. For the path. And our first one will go to login. And the component that we will run when we want to go to login will be the login component. The second route that we want to have in here will be a path that goes to account, and the component that we're going to go to there will be the account component. So that is our routes array set up with our two different paths there ready for us to go. Hang on, one tick. These should be strings. Now we're good to go. Just before we finish here, we need to import our two different components so that we know what we're talking about here. So there will be the login component, and it will come from a file that is in the login directory called login.component. And the second one will be the same sort of thing except for account. So account, account.component. Okay, I just noticed I actually had a typo in my spelling of account. I had ACOOUNT, so I've just changed that back to ACCOUNT and renamed some files and just make sure any reference to that had been changed in these particular files here, and also down in the app module where it would have taken a reference from there, and there. So I've changed that. So we should be able to, now that we've created the routes for in our routing module, we've created a route for login and for account. So if we run this now, if we click on login, we should, in the position where we had our router outlet, we can now see the login component loaded into that position. Or if we click on account, we see the component for account loaded in that particular position. So let's go back now and we'll focus on the login module to complete the code that we need for that. So let's back to Atom. Okay, so we're going to be working with forms, and with Angular, the language is broken down into multiple segments because you don't want to be loading all of the functionality of Angular for every page. So only a minimum amount is actually loaded in by default. So we're actually going to want to import in here a link to the forms module. This will give us access to forms and doing stuff that we want to do with them, and it comes from the Angular/forms. If you want to know where I'm grabbing this from, if we have a quick look here, so this is our directory structure that is holding our particular application. And if we have a look in the node modules directory, you'll notice this @Angular. You'll notice the @Angular here. So in @Angular directory, and you'll notice here the range of different subdirectories, which will then match up with our @Angular core, @Angular forms. So we're adding in, importing in code from this node module that we'll then be able to use within our particular application. A second import that we're going to need in here will be for our router, and it will come from @Angular/router. So that should be the minimum number of imports that we require here. Now with our particular form, we're going to be grabbing a username and password, and we're going to be able to want to create a model or some variables that we'll be able to bind to save any data inputs that the user puts in for those particular fields. So we'll have a username, and it will be of type string, and by default we'll just set that to being an empty string, and we'll want a password. It will also be of type string, and we'll set that by default to an empty string. Our constructors, we're going to have two different models or modules that we'll need to load to be able to use. So we'll create the private router as type router that we have imported from here, and we will also include in here a private form from the forms module. Okay, so how are we going to get the information from our form into the back end? There needs to be some trigger of what happens. So our trigger will be coming from a submit of our particular form. So on a particular submit, we're going to then call a function. In this case, I'll just call it login user, and it's going to pass in the event. So the event, which is the trigger of the submit event of clicking on this particular button. So let's go back to our login components. So we're going to want to now create that function that we called, which was login user. So this is another method we're going to create on our class of our login component. And it will take one parameter, which is an event. Now, the standard process of a form submission is for the information to be packaged up, sent off to the server to do something with that form, and then send back a whole new page. Now, we really don't want that to happen. We don't want our page being reloaded. That'd be restarting the app. So what we want to do is prevent the default action, which is to submit it off to the server, and stop that event action from happening. So there is a function available called prevent default, and get my spelling, which will stop the submission of that events, that whole action, the chain of things that were going to happen, stops that in its tracks. So then we can then hijack that and then do the code that we want to do on that particular event data. So at this stage, we haven't done anything to actually link our form inputs with the data that we're going to have within our login component. So the next thing we need to do is to come back into our HTML, and we need to create in here ng model, so this is a square bracket and then round bracket notation. I've heard it called as in banana in a box. So you think of, you got the box outside and then your banana one's inside, and it will be equal to username. So this is a way of creating a two-way binding, so that any changes made on the form as you type it in will be bound to the username variable within the component. So the one that we defined within the class over here. And any changes we may make programmatically within our component will also then be reflected back into the data that's displayed on the form. So we'll want to do another mg model, and it will be equal to password. Okay, so this should now link as we enter data in this form input. Then the variables that are part of our login component will be set, which means in our login user function, we can then do something with these particular variables that are now in scope. So let's just do a quick check to make sure that we're actually getting information back. So if we do a console.log and we want to look at this username, remembering that we're working within a class and this is a member of the class, so we want to say for this class, so it's this username is what we use to grab that variable. And get my typing right again. Okay, so let's go back to here. We'll reload this, go to our login page, stick in a name, and when we do submit, so over on this side here, I'm running this in inspect mode with the console open, so that stuff that's written to the JavaScript console, we'll be able to see that appearing over here. Okay, so when I did submit, we will then see that name then comes across, so we know we're getting that value and being able to do something with it. So let's go back now, and we'll be able to create some code which will compare the username and password entered against a pre-made up one inside our code. So we don't need that anymore. So what we want to do is if our this dot username is equal to, using the double equals as comparative, let's say I'll make it Alan, and this dot password is equal to 123, then we're going to do something. And what we want to do is our this dot router. Remember, in our constructor we've passed in our router object, and we'll want to navigate by URL, and we want to go to the account route. So only if our username and password is Alan and 123 should we then move on to the account route. Let's save that. Let's go back to here, and we'll just reload our page. And so if we put in a name of Alan and a password of 123, we should now and have moved on to the account route, because it's now showing that account information in that router outlet. If we go back to the login again and we put in something other than what is required and we hit submit, then nothing happens because we never got navigated to a new URL. If we then put in the required text, we then get routed to the accounts module or the accounts component. Okay, so the last part of this to do, if we have a look at our task sheet, was if the inputs don't match, then we should put up some sort of error message. So if we come back to our code and we have a look here, so that if it did match, we went to the account, we need to add on an else option, a simple alert message. So this is using a standard JavaScript alert function that we can pass through some text. So we might just say username and password were incorrect. So we'll save that, come back to our page, go to our login, let's type in something that's not correct, and we should now get our alert message telling us that our username and password were incorrect, and then we get to have another go. If you put in the correct information, then we come to our accounts page. So the last part of this task is basically for you to create a new Git repository called Angular Labs and commit this work into it. In week 5, we will extend on this and do some more stuff with our login page to set up some session variables, etc. Okay.